Anders.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
And we welcome you to the Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN, the Global Catholic Radio Network. Very blessed to be broadcasting today, at least I am, from the 2020 LA Religious Educators Congress. We are here in beautiful Orange County at the Anaheim Convention Center. Somewhere north of 30,000 people are here, really from all walks of life, primarily educators. So it should be a lot of fun as we're progressing through the hour. As you know, the name of the program, Call to Communion, really tells the story. This is a program on EWTN for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. So if that is you, we would love to hear from you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside the U.S. and Canada, you'll want to dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And of course, you can always shoot us an email, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. We also have Ryan Penny handling the phone screening today. And Jeff Burson is on social media. So if you have any questions that you want to pose via Facebook or YouTube, we can certainly tackle those as well. I'm Tom Price here in Anaheim along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
You know what? I'm doing great. How are you today, my friend?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well, thanks.
Now, since you're the guy with the emails, we're going to pitch it right back to you for our first email as we're getting some of these calls screened.
All right, thanks. This first one is from Logan, who writes in on Facebook and says, "The only thing that is keeping me from being Catholic in the fullness of the church would be that my wife is divorced due to her ex-husband committing adultery throughout their 10 years of marriage. I am, of course, nervous about the decree of nullity and the results that it could bring. What kinds of encouragement do you have for those who are waiting on this decree?" Yeah, thanks, Logan. I really appreciate the question. Well, I would tell you, take heart, have hope, be encouraged. I think that given the way that her ex-husband was behaving, the odds are very strong that in my judgment, which, not infallible judgment, but this is kind of what I think, that you will get the decree of nullity, and she'll be freed up to be validly married sacramentally in the Catholic Church. Now, the process that you're going through, I mean, look, my heart goes out to you. It's difficult. It's difficult. There's no doubt about it. And in my own life, on my path into the Catholic faith, I didn't have to get a decree of nullity, but there was a question canonically about the validity of my marriage because my wife had been raised Catholic, left the church, and we were married in a Protestant church, and a bunch of hullabaloo. And when I was confronted with this question of, well, maybe your marriage is not valid, I was a bit undone by it initially. But the process of actually like doing that discernment, thinking through what does the church really mean by marriage? What am I committing to? What might I be committing to this time around that I didn't actually commit to the first time around? Because the Catholic Church has a very specific doctrine of marriage, what it means to commit to those vows. And then making those promises, knowing that this is a sacramental act in front of the church, it has a different significance. All of that was tremendously spiritually fruitful in my life and my wife's life. And I really think this is an opportunity to deepen your own conversion, your own love for one another, your commitment to the church and your faith. And the difficulties that you're going through now, you'll be able to look back on in the years to come and say, these things God permitted for the sake of this much greater spiritual fruit that's come into our life. And I think the outcome is going to be very, very, very agreeable to you.
All right, very good. Our phone number again is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We do have a call screened. Looks like we have 3 lines open right now. 3 are in the process of being screened. David, we have another email here?
Yeah, this one, thank you, is from Todd, who writes in on YouTube and says, "What body was Jesus sharing with his apostles at the Last Supper? If the sacrifice of the Mass is a representation of Calvary, how do we offer his glorified body if he has not yet been glorified? This is a great question about the mode of Christ's presence in the Eucharist and the relationship of the Mass to Calvary. I love this question. So here's the answer. When the priest consecrates the host, and that would be true of Christ himself, the great high priest, when he consecrated the host on Holy Thursday in the upper room, Christ is made substantially present in the host in his proper person exactly as he exists historically in time at that moment. So, when the priest says Mass today, it is Christ, the glorified Son of God at the right hand of the Father, who is made substantially present in the host. When Christ consecrated the host at the Last Supper, it was Jesus sitting at the table with his disciples who was made substantially present in the host. So St. Augustine would say, Christ held himself in his own hands. Right?
Wow.
St. Thomas Aquinas poses this hypothetical question. What if the apostles had celebrated Mass when Jesus was in the tomb? They did not do so, but it's an interesting question. And what St. Thomas answers, consistent with good Eucharistic theology of the Church, is if that had happened, you would have had the body and blood and divinity of Christ substantially present in the host, but not his human soul, which had descended to the dead, because he was, of course, physically dead. So the point being that it's Christ in his proper person as he presently historically exists at the time that Mass is separated. What does that have to do with Calvary, right? The Calvary is a once-for-all bloody sacrifice. The Mass is not a once-for-all bloody sacrifice. It is the memorial of the death and resurrection of Jesus, in which the true Christ is present, right, under the appearance of bread and wine, two species separately consecrated which appear to be in a state of separation. Body here, blood there. When the Mass was celebrated on Holy Thursday, you had the anticipation of the cross. When the Mass is celebrated today, you have the memorial of the cross. But the efficacy, the power, the fruit, the virtue of Christ's sacrifice is made present to us today in every Mass so that the fruits of Calvary can be applied to our lives.
All right, very good. David, thank you so much for that. And if you have if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, do give us a call at 833-288-3986. In a moment, we'll be talking with John in Tampa, Leslie in Texas, Marianne in Arizona. Lots more straight ahead on the Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Do stay with us.
I'm Jeanette DeMello, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register and co-host of Register Radio with Matthew Bunson. Join us every week as we talk with the Register's expert writers and editors about the news you need to know and offer authentic Catholic insights on the important stories that impact your life. Register Radio, every Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern and Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern, here on EWTN Global Catholic Radio.
Looking for a 2020 view on how Catholics are voting in the upcoming election? EWTN News and Real Clear Opinion Research are partnering to bring you clear and concise data on where the nation stands on issues, candidates, policies, and more by surveying Americans, including Catholics like you. And it's available now at EWTNnews.com/poll.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
I want you to have such confidence in the Lord that you'll find such hope at seeing the beauty of the Lord, the majesty of God. What did our Lord say, huh? If your sins are as scarlet, oh, what? What's going to happen? They shall be made white as snow.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
It is called to communion here on EWTN. Let me give you that phone number one more time before we go to it, and that is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We're broadcasting live from the 2020 Los Angeles Religious Educators Congress here at the Anaheim Convention Center. One of the people that is here at the Convention Center and who will be one of the speakers is our friend, and that's Bishop Robert Barron. And he's going to be on the air tomorrow on his great weekend show, Word on Fire. This week, Bishop Barron will be discussing Stoicism and Christianity. Should be a fascinating program. That's actually tomorrow, Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern, 10:30 a.m. Eastern, here on EWTN Radio. Word on Fire with Bishop Barron, Sunday a.m. at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. All right, if you're ready, let's go to the phones right now at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with John in Tampa, listening on the EWTN app. Hey there, John. What's on your mind today?
Hey, thank you for taking my call. Your show is a blessing in my life. I am often in discussions with Protestants, and I try to use Protestant theologians as a response and what they're saying to prove a point, but I always get stuck when I get to the point where they say, well, you've got your resources and they disagree with our resources, and so we're not going to prove anything. What do I say then?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So the assertion assumes that there's no independent way to evaluate incompatible systems, right? And if that were true, you start from your premises, I start from my premises, we each reason to our set of conclusions. Our conclusions differ, but it's because our fundamental premises differ, and there's really no way to adjudicate those differences at all. Well, then we would be stuck, and we would also be reduced to relativism, which I suppose probably most of your Protestant friends don't hold. They're not actually relativists, but they don't know how to think their way out of this box, and so they punt the problem, or they use it as a way to shut down dialogue. So there are some ways around this. One of them is to begin to explore not your different theological conclusions, not your theological convictions, but to draw to the level of awareness our different starting points and the different ways in which we do theology, and make that the subject of the discussion. Rather than debating, well, is Mary ever virgin? Was she immaculately conceived? The kind of the end points. Actually get into the first principles of how we do theology, the Protestant way of doing theology, the Catholic way of doing theology, and have the discussion at that level. And then you can actually evaluate these incommensurate theological systems to see which one is better at adhering to its own principles and explaining the greatest amount of data, theologically speaking, and which one has the most unassumed or unexamined axioms. Now, there is a good resource that I'd like to give you on actually how you do this. How do you engage charitably in dialogue with another religious system in a respectful way that can bring a level of analysis that kind of transcends those differences? And it's an article on the Called to Communion website by a friend of mine named Brian Cross, Bryan Cross, and the title of the article is Virtue and Dialogue, Ecumenism and the Heart. And it's about the proper virtues and dispositions needed to engage in just the kind of dialogue that you're talking about. Now, to bring all of that down to a real simple conclusion, I like to begin discussions with Protestants on first principles with this question: how do we do theology? How do we actually reason to theological conclusions? And did Jesus himself say anything about that? Did Christ himself give us a rule of faith? Did he give us a guide to help us form our Christian thought? And of course, built into the question is my assumption that he did, namely he gave us the teaching office of the church. So that's where I like to go. Really appreciate the question. Thanks, John.
Very good. Hey, John, thank you so much for your call. And that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. The Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Leslie now in Celeste, Texas, listening on the great Guadalupe Radio, AM 910. Hey, Leslie, what's on your mind today?
Hi, y'all, and thank you so much. Hey, I've got kind of a general question. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about what Catholic social teaching or social justice ideas are. I hear those words and terms, and in this day and age, my mind leaps to communism, and I know that's probably ridiculous, But could you shed some light on what is meant when I hear terms like that used and how it's a major, major part of the Catholic Church?
Absolutely. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. So your caution is well advised. I commend you for your suspicion. The reason I say so is that sometimes people will talk about the Catholic doctrine of social justice as if it were simply the same thing as a leftist social political program. And that is an illegitimate move. I mean, yes, there are people who talk that way, but that's not legitimate. It's not valid at all. And the popes have condemned that way of reasoning about social questions. Pope John Paul II addressed that error very, very clearly in one of his encyclicals called Solicitudo Rei Socialis, if you care to read it, in which he said, the Church's social teaching is not political ideology. It's not political ideology. What do I mean by political ideology? Well, a political ideology is a theory about the best way to arrange society, down to granular detail, to solve social problems. Capitalism is an ideology in political economy. Communism is an ideology. The two major political parties in the United States are infused with various political ideologies. Those things have no intrinsic connection at all to Catholic social teaching. No essential connection. All right. Although both of them might claim to be founded in Catholic social teaching, rightly or wrongly. So what is Catholic social teaching? Well, the Catholic Church teaches that justice, that the moral demands of being a human person are not just between an individual God and his individual friends. It's not just a one-on-one relationship, but that individuals have responsibilities to civil society and that civil societies have responsibilities to the individual. And how do you discern those responsibilities? What do they look like? Well, they're grounded in a few fundamental premises. Let me list some of them for you. The fundamental premise of all Catholic social teaching is the doctrine that individual human beings have dignity. Now you go, well, that's kind of a no-brainer. Well, you would think so. You would think so. But throughout history, many civilizations have denied that the individual has an inherent dignity. Some civilizations have treated individuals like they were fingernails, and you could clip them off without fault and without consequence in view of some, other idea. So, good example, Nazism. Nazism was a civilization that did not regard the dignity of the individual. They looked only to a certain collective, namely their sort of racially pure ideal, and they were content to treat everybody else like refuse, not respecting the dignity of the person. Another principle of Catholic social teaching is the principle of solidarity, that if I have dignity and you have dignity, then I should regard your dignity as well as my own, right? I shouldn't just be looking out for my rights. I should be looking out for your rights and your needs, and that the whole civilization has a responsibility of care for everyone to some extent. Subsidiarity is another principle of Catholic social teaching. That means that I should not offload onto some government superstructure a job that I should do at the level of the family or the local community. So, for example, it's my job to take care of my kids. I should not try to offload that responsibility onto the state, right? I mean, that's my responsibility. I'm dad. I mean, I need to take care of them. I can't offload that onto somebody else. Similarly, my local neighborhood community should take care of my garbage pickup. I shouldn't get the federal government to come in and do that. That destroys, these natural relationships that many of them exist before and in differentiation from the state. And so institutions like the family, the church, the wider community, these things are very, very important, have to be respected, right? That's another principle. Another principle of Catholic social teaching is that the family is the primary cell of society. And so I shouldn't endorse any political ideology, any system that is fundamentally destructive of the family. And I could go on and on. We could talk all day about different principles, but this is the way we work. So we start with a conception of moral theology about the human person, and then work our way out to these moral principles that can down the road be put into place in the form of political policy. But there's not one political ideology that can rightly claim just to represent Catholic social teaching.
All right, very good. Leslie, thank you so much for your call. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Tom Price here along with Dr. David Anders. I am at the LA Religious Educators Congress here in Anaheim at the enormous Anaheim Convention Center. Let's go now to Mary Ann in Arizona, listening to us today on Sirius XM Channel 130. Hey, Mary Ann, what's on your mind today?
Yes, good afternoon. I have a daughter who went to a Tridentine Mass, which I have no problem with a Tridentine Mass, and I think Cardinal or Bishop Lefevre came back into the fold with this Tridentine Mass, and she absolutely loved it. And it's like Immaculate Heart or something. And it was a 2-hour high Mass, all in Latin, and she was so mesmerized by it, and she just loves it. The people all wore dresses and chapel veils, and that I don't know that, is that a problem to go to a Tridentine Mass that is maybe not in the fold? I know that Father Siri and Pope Benedict Emeritus both would approve of that now. I'm not sure that Pope Francis would approve of it.
I appreciate the question. So Pope Benedict issued an apostolic letter called Summorum Pontificum that gave permission to all Roman priests, priests of the Roman Rite, Catholic priests, to offer Mass in the extraordinary form, according to the Tridentine Rite, if they have a community that asks for it. And so many, many dioceses throughout the world have priests that regularly celebrate the Tridentine Mass or the Mass in the extraordinary form. And it is legitimate, it's lawful, and valid for Catholics to participate in those Masses. There are other organizations that are not Catholic or not fully Catholic or that lack some canonical standing within the Catholic Church that also offer or claim to offer a valid Tridentine Mass. The question of the validity of those Masses, if they're not offered by Catholic priests that have some valid jurisdiction in the Church, the question of the validity of those Masses must be determined on a case-by-case basis. There are some organizations that operate a little bit outside the fold of the Catholic Church, but for various reasons do in fact have validly ordained priests, and those Masses would be valid if illicit. There are other organizations that claim to be Catholic and claim to have jurisdiction, but in fact have neither jurisdiction nor validity. And so you must look to more than simply the form of the Mass. You also have to ask who is celebrating it. Is it a validly ordained priest, ordained by a validly ordained bishop? And does that priest have some sort of jurisdiction so that he can offer it both validly and licitly? And that I would have to know more about the group that celebrated the Mass in order to answer those questions more precisely.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack when you're talking about the Society of St. Pius X, correct?
Yes, but she didn't mention the SSPX.
Well, she did mention Archbishop Lefebvre.
Okay, so if it is SSPX, then it would be valid, and yet those priests do not actually have any they don't have any jurisdiction in the Church. So they're operating in disobedience to the Pope, and my recommendation to your daughter would be, let's find a validly ordained priest of the Catholic Church who has a valid jurisdiction from a bishop who is celebrating the Mass in the extraordinary form. That way she can gratify that desire to celebrate to go to the Mass in that form, but without running afoul of the church hierarchy.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you so much, Mary Ann. We appreciate that. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Let's quickly go to Peter now in Seattle, listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Peter, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Dr. Anders. Thanks for taking my call. I have a question about praying to the saints. Okay. If a Protestant believes in the doctrine of praying to the saints, will the saints listen to that person's prayers even though that person's not Catholic?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So, yes and no, right? Yes and no. Even when a Catholic asks a saint to pray for him, not all prayers are equally effective. St. James tells us that the prayer of a righteous man is effective, is more effective. So one of the benefits, actually, of praying to saints is they're righteous. So if I ask something that's a little bit off base, it's going to get cleaned up before he passes it on to the higher-ups, if you follow me, right?
Sure.
And to the extent to which we ask in good faith and with pure motives for spiritual goods, God will never refuse the faithful, penitent, consistent prayer for those graces necessary for salvation.
Very good, Peter. Thank you so much for your call. Lots more straight ahead on the Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Stay with us.
This is Father Donald Calloway. Join me for our 33-day consecration to St. Joseph after the Rosary with Father Benedict Rochelle, tonight, 9:30 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
And this is an EWTN Bookmark Brief. I'm Doug Keck. I just had the great pleasure of speaking with Dr. Ray Guarendi about his latest book, Raising Upright Kids in an Upside-Down World, Defying the Anti-Parent Culture. Dr. Ray, there's a lot to take in there. Focus the book for me.
The culture is now hostile to parents. And the more moral and traditional you want to raise your child, the more hostile the culture will be. You got to recognize where it's hostile, and you got to have the strength to defy it. Nobody's saying protect them from everything. You protect them enough so that your voice is louder than all those other voices. Many parents will tell me just the fact that one voice said, it's okay, you're allowed, you can stand strong, gives them enough.
Raising Upright Kids in an Upside-Down World, Defying the Anti-Parent Culture. And, of course, look for the entire interview coming soon on the network. Check out this book, available as we speak from the EWTN Religious Catalog. EWTNRC.com is the place. Thanks for stopping by. This has been an EWTN Bookmark Brief.
EWTN, communicating the faith.
Just turned 31. Feel that I'm being called to the priesthood, and I've been attending daily Mass and just finding that falling more in love with Jesus every day and finding more opportunities to, make sacrifices for Him, of myself, and just allow Him to enter me more. How do we fully surrender to God and to His will so that we can more clearly hear His calling?
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Hi, this is Janet Williams. There's nothing like Women of Grace to explain the truth of our faith, Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern, here on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, it's the Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Glad that you're with us. Tom Price here at the EWTN's 2020 Los Angeles Religious Educators Conference. Awful lot of educators here, teachers and administrators from really all over the place. A big hall, David, probably over 30,000 people in this hall. It's an amazing thing.
Well, so I'm always impressed when you guys go out there.
A lot of wonderful people here. Let's get back to the phones, though, right now. Here is Matt in Columbus, Ohio, listening on the Blowtorch St. Gabriel Radio. Hey, Matt, what's on your mind today?
Hi. Recently was watching a PBS show, and it dealt with the Jesuits in Georgetown and historical slave ownership and then the sale of slaves by the Jesuits so that they could pay off the debt of the college. And I don't know if that's all historically accurate. But since you were talking about social justice, I was just trying to get my head wrapped around how we might look at that today.
Okay, sure. I appreciate the question. So the Catholic Church teaches that slavery is objectively immoral, and it's a grave sin against human dignity for many reasons, right? For many reasons, but part of human dignity flows from most of it flows from our creation in God's likeness and image. because we're all rational. We image him in our rationality and the freedom of our will. And to properly exercise those powers and to be able to seek for God and to respond to his grace, we need to have control of our own person. And so being sold in chattel slavery to somebody else greatly violates that inherent dignity, right? So it's a gross evil. Now, historically, the church's understanding and awareness of the evil of slavery and the proper way to deal with it in civil society is something that has developed over time. And so when you read the teaching of Jesus and St. Paul, for example, the doctrine of human dignity comes to the forefront, but neither one of them is particularly focused on the question of sort of drastically reforming the wider social order outside of the Christian church. And within the Christian church, St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he says, I'll judge the behavior of believers. I'm not going to worry about unbelievers right now. And leave them, let God will take care of them. And he had enough trouble dealing with the people in Corinth. And they, of course, didn't have the capacity to radically reconfigure the wider Roman world. But within the dynamic of the church itself and its own history, slavery was gradually abolished, right? It ceased to exist because there were principles laid down about the way we treat one another that made it incompatible with Christian civilization. And it didn't really emerge again in the same way as a moral issue until the early modern period, the age of exploration. And the scholastics dealt with the question, and they considered whether slavery was intrinsically morally immoral, whether it was a good or bad idea. And the overall consensus was it's a bad idea and it's an evil. But they weren't thinking in the way of social reformers, because for them it was just kind of a theoretical question. It wasn't really a part of Christian civilization the way it had been in ancient civilization. At the age of exploration, when Europeans got on boats, went across to foreign seas, and began enslaving indigenous peoples, the question was raised again. And interestingly, the earliest human rights thinkers that began to oppose the practice and argue that indigenous peoples themselves possess the image of God and all the rights and dignity that would flow from that, and they ought not to be enslaved by European conquistadors, those were in fact Catholic priests and religious. Francisco de Vitoria, Dominican thinker of the early modern period, actually inaugurated reflection on human rights and the dignity of indigenous peoples. When the slave trade began as a cross-Atlantic, transatlantic practice, the popes repeatedly issued condemnations of transatlantic slavery, right? And so we see here kind of a growing awareness of the impact of the thing. It took a while for those principles to actually work themselves out into an absolute prohibition on slavery as a social institution per se. And of course, the church fully embraces that idea. So keep in mind as well that while these things are kind of being worked out in real time, Catholic priests are also the ones who are seeing to the pastoral and spiritual needs of those that were enslaved. So St. Peter Claver, for example, who's a Spanish Jesuit, who goes to Colombia specifically to live among the poorest of the poor and minister to those enslaved Africans that the church had said should not be enslaved and shouldn't be in those conditions. And you'll find Jesuits and other religious around the world today doing very much the same thing. They may be working in civilizations and societies where there's a lot of injustice. They may not be able to change the whole civilization, but they're working soul by soul to try to improve people's lot and situation, as well as advocating for social justice at a wider scale.
Matt, thank you so much for your call. It is Call to Communion here on EWTN. Glad to be with you on this Friday afternoon. We're going now to Gary. Gary is in Denver listening to Amazon, first-time caller. Hey, Gary, what's on your mind today?
Hey there, Dave. I have a question at first. It doesn't need to be answered, and then I have an allegement that you can toy with if you like. My question is, were there government pledges given to foster kids or adopted kids that shouldn't ever be prospered by sexual masses, much like Catholic bishops can gift Easter seals to special care cases? And my allegement to my...
I'm sorry, I lost the call and I didn't follow it anyway. I apologize.
Okay. Gary, call us back. We'll try to get that back on. Let's go now to Mark in right on the border there between Idaho and Washington, listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
Well, when Christ, before he died on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I've always assumed that was just for the Roman soldiers that were crucifying him, but can that be taken as a bigger picture of forgiving the entire Jewish population or the entire Roman population?
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. Well, first of all, to clarify, the Catholic Church is extremely explicit that the Jews, neither individually nor collectively, were not solely responsible for the death of Christ. That every human soul, every individual, because we're all personally sinners, are all collectively responsible for the condition for which Christ came to provide a remedy. So we don't pin that on the Jews. We don't pin that just on the Romans. I'm just as responsible. I'm just as responsible. Now, your question about when Christ prays, forgive them for they know not what they do, does that have a sort of wider import than simply those that were gathered at the foot of the cross or who were hammering the nails? And I think the answer has got to be yes. St. Paul tells us in 1 Timothy chapter 1, speaking of himself, he says, I was formerly a blasphemer and a persecutor, but I received mercy because I acted out of ignorance and unbelief. So to the extent that we truly do not know what we do, God does not hold us fully responsible for our actions. Now, can we ever use that truth to give ourselves a pass, so to speak, to absolve ourselves of moral responsibility because we claim ignorance? No, I don't think that's a wise response, because we do know we have a moral obligation to inform ourselves. So if I'm looking at a situation, I don't know if it's right or wrong, I can't just cover my eyes, put on a blindfold, and jump in with both feet. I need to try to inform my conscience. But if I do what I can do in good faith to learn the moral truth, and yet I'm still ignorant, then I'm not responsible for my activity. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Mark, thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion in progress here on EWTN. Looks like we have one line open right now. If you want to give it a shot, we'll get to as many calls as we can today. And that number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here now is Matt in Columbus on St. Gabriel Radio. Matt, what's on your mind today?
Good afternoon, Dr. Anders.
Hey, how are you?
I wanted to ask about I teach in a public school, and I'm having some difficulty conveying the idea of moral absolutism to my public high school students. We were discussing a short story today, and they even went so far, to their credit, remaining intellectually consistent, to claim that you can't say that former slave owners of the South were in the wrong because they thought it was okay in that society to own slaves. And so we kind of followed down that line, and they seem to understand that the moral absolutist position implies the existence of God. And so a lot of them were saying oh yes, from a religious standpoint, that's what a lot of people say, but if you don't believe in God, then ... So I'm wondering how I can explain that without referencing God as the moral absolute.
Okay, thanks. So there are a couple ways to do this. And, of course, we're dealing with high schoolers. We're not dealing with graduate students in philosophy, and we would take a different approach with each. But we'll do a little of both. I think with high schoolers, one easy way to start is simply propose cases to them where it's very, very unlikely that any of them will assert their moral indifference. So, is it always and everywhere wrong to torture babies for fun? Is there any possible universe in which the Nazi Holocaust is allowable? I mean, these kinds of cases, right? And you'll probably have a couple of rabble rousers in the corner that will assert the relativist point of view just to raise an eyebrow. But eventually, I think you're going to be able to get the majority to agree that, okay, there are some things that are just fundamentally wrong in any moral universe. And you could come up with a few principles that are widely held across cultures and moral systems. And I don't know of any society, for example, where courage is valued, where cowardice is viewed as virtuous or praiseworthy. You're not going to find many societies where the hatred of parents for their children is viewed as commendable. I mean, you see the point that I'm raising, and you've got concrete acts that are morally evil, then you can look at sort of character traits and dispositions that are widely held across civilizations to be desirable. What civilization thinks that ignorance is better than knowledge or wisdom? These kinds of things. So that's one way to start. Now, I don't like it when people suggest that God is a uniquely religious concept, because it suggests to me that they have a pretty anemic concept of God. All right. I do think you can say if there really are absolute right and wrongs, then there's got to be some sort of transcendent reference point. But it need not necessarily be conceptualized as God. I mean, there's other ways to conceptualize that relationship. And in fact, there are whole civilizations, Indian civilization, for example, with a variety of religious systems that have very keen ideas on absolute right and wrong without ever explicitly invoking, say, the Judeo-Christian idea of God.
Okay, very good. And we thank you so much for your call, Matt. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. If you're not familiar with Catholic News Agency, we can certainly recommend that in this era of fake news, and there's an awful lot of fake news out there. CNA is the only fast, reliable, and free Catholic news source that brings you blogs and stories and opinions and so much more at your fingertips. And by the way, if it is an opinion, we're going to label it as an opinion. We're not going to say, well, this is a fact. Well, no, this particular thing here, this is an opinion, and we're going to label it that way. For all the latest Catholic news, visit CatholicNewsAgency.com, CatholicNewsAgency.com. You won't be sorry. Lots more going on here on Call to Communion here on EWTN. We'll get to as many calls as we can today. Here is Ann now in Wilmington, Delaware, listening on Ave Maria Radio. Ann, what's on your mind today?
Hello. I'm a little nervous. I have a question, please, that kind of dovetails to an earlier caller. She was inquiring about the Latin Mass. And my question is, both Masses, the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass, are legitimate, valid Masses. Why do the priests seem so reluctant to have a Latin Mass, like even a Latin wedding or baptism? Why is it that the majority of them seem to be so reluctant to say a Latin Mass?
Sure.
Is there a reason?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are reasons both ideological and practical. The ordinary form of the Mass, the vernacular, is the ordinary form. It's the ordinary form. That's the form that's been promulgated by the Church to be the normal way of celebrating it, and that's the way the Pope celebrates it. And the priests of the Latin Rite want to be in communion with the Holy Father, and say the ordinary form because it's the ordinary form. One of the reasons for the reform of the Mass after the Second Vatican Council was to put a stronger emphasis on the active participation of the laity. So there were prayers and rubrics for the laity in the Reformed Mass of Paul VI. So, there are responses that the laity articulate, for example, and gestures that they perform. So they have an explicit liturgical function, and it's not just to sit there as passive recipients. And many priests are rightly, I judge, sensitive. They're sympathetic to that aim. All right, so that plays into their pastoral philosophy of how the Mass should be engaged by the laity. Now there are proponents on the other side. There are ideological proponents of the Tridentine Mass that believe that it is inherently more reverent, or perhaps that it highlights the sacrificial character of the Mass more. And those are also values that are worthy of pursuit. Now, what happens in one community when you seem to have two sort of ideological views that are potentially in opposition to one another, well, then you actually set up the possibility of a conflict and of ideological battle lines being drawn. And if there's one thing that is absolutely against the spirit of the Catholic Church, against the teaching of St. Paul, against the teaching of Christ in the Scriptures, it is that we are not to have ideological battle lines drawn within the Church. St. Paul says, do not say, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, I follow Paul, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Apollos. No, we all follow Christ, right? We have to agree on everything. We have to be on the same page.
Sure.
And so if a priest thought that having both forms might ignite an ideological war within his parish, well, that would be another value to be considered in making that pastoral decision.
All right. And we thank you so much for your call and call to communion in progress here on EWTN. Let's go now to Vince. Vince is in Toledo listening via podcast right now. Hello, Vince. What's on your mind today?
Hey, good afternoon, gentlemen. I normally listen to podcasts, and I've been a little bit behind. This morning, I listened to your broadcast from the 4th of February. In that broadcast, a question was presented substituting the letter X for the word Christ in Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I know it was recent for me, and it was a while back for you, so I apologize for the disconnect in time, but I was struck by Dr. Anders' response. And I don't understand how being in friendship with Christ allows one to accept Xing out Christ's name from the Mass of his birth.
Okay, David?
Okay, yeah, thanks. So I certainly don't want to take Jesus out of Christmas, not at all whatsoever. And if that's the hill you want to die on, be my guest. I mean, that's fine. I understand your point of view, and I certainly don't oppose the spirit that animates it. That's great. I mean, have at it.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave that. Thank you so much for your call, Vince. Let's go now to Mary. Mary's listening on Long Island on Sirius XM 130. Hey, Mary, what's on your mind today? Mary in Long Island? Not there. Let's go on to Tammy then. Tammy is in Fort Wayne listening on Redeemer Radio, a first-time caller. Hey, Tammy, what's on your mind today?
I'm wondering how to battle against someone who is trying to teach a child to worship the moon and crystals. And my stepdaughter, who we have custody of, her mother is always telling her that there's no God and all of this, and tries to get her to worship funny things. And I'm wondering how I feel like I'm continually battling against the evil to save this child's soul. And I'm wondering if you had any advice on that.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
So let me ask a question. You said this is your stepdaughter?
Yes.
Does the child live with you?
Yes, we have custody. Her mother lost custody of her.
Okay. And so the mother, she sees the mother on occasion, and when she does, the mother is working at cross purposes to your catechism. That's what you're telling me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think, first of all, how old is the child?
She is now 13, and she attends St. Charles School here in Fort Wayne, which her mother fought us on tooth and nail. But she's now 13.
Okay, all right. So at the age of 13, there is going to be a lot that's much more important to this child than simply the intellectual question of God's existence. And I don't think you're going to be able to win this battle simply at the level of catechetics or argument. Moral formation is going to be an absolutely critical part of this question. So my advice to you would be to create the kind of environment in your home that is conducive to belief in the Catholic Church. And that means not only that you talk about the faith and that you pray the faith and that you serve others in acts of charity, but that you and your husband also be unfailingly fair, but also just. Don't give her slack where she doesn't need slack. I mean, you have to have your standards and your rules, but you enforce your rules and your discipline with silence to the extent that's possible. Don't lecture people. Lecturing folks almost never works, kind of alienates them. And be supportive and kind and open, just and fair, sound of mind, reasonable, and let the whole environment of the home confirm what you're teaching. Now, I have no idea what the stepmother is like. I don't know what the character of her life is like. But if it's disordered in any way, that's going to create both the temptation for your daughter to see that as kind of like loosey-goosey land where I get to go and I'm allowed to do whatever I want. But it may also have the opposite effect of presenting a kind of disordered and frenetic example that stands in stark contrast to the sanity and benevolence of a Catholic home. Somebody who is more skillful than I am at negotiating those sort of inter-family dynamics is Dr. Ray Garindi, whose show The Doctor Is In comes on an hour before this show. And, he's a therapist, child psychologist, family therapist who deals with this kind of thing all the time and has just a ton of practical experience that I like. I'm more of a theological guy.
He is fantastic. So there's a great reference for you there, Tammy. Let's see if we have another email. Do you have another email in your bag of tricks there, David?
Oh, yeah, I sure do. Let's see.
Fantastic.
Okay, so John writes a text and says, without the doctrine of penal substitution, how do you understand that Christ bears our sin in his body and that we have been healed by his wounds, as is taught by 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24. All right, so what's at stake here? All right, oftentimes on the show, I contrast the Catholic understanding of the death of Christ with the Protestant or Calvinist understanding of the death of Christ. The Catholic Church follows sacred scripture that teaches that the death of Christ is a sacrifice of atonement. And a sacrifice of atonement, if you read the Old Testament, was when a worshiper would bring something of value, like a lamb or a bull or a goat or a turtle dove or whatever, and immolate it, sacrifice it, deprive himself of its use, some valuable thing, in order to make an act of reparation to God. And we see little sacrifices of atonement like that all the time in our own private and civil life. And I often give the example that, say I offend my wife at something, God forbid, and she lets me know that she's a bit ticked off. And I come back and say, honey, I'm sorry. I might then make some act of reparation. I might go out and get her a box of chocolate or flowers or something and offer that to her. I'm not giving her the flowers so that she can hurl them on the ground and stomp on them and get it out of her system, so to speak, but as a token of love. And that's what the Church says the death of Christ was. Now, the Protestant view is that Christ is punished by God in place of us for our sins. And that's the theory of penal substitution. That's incorrect, and Scripture doesn't teach it. When you read in 1 Peter that he bore our wounds in his body on the tree, it simply means he entered into the human condition. He suffered as a human being on our behalf.
Okay. And there we go. Thank you for that email. By the way, if you'd like to send us an email for a future show, the address ctc@ewtn.com. David, a wonderful week of programming, and I hope that you have a great weekend, my friend.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
A lot of fun here at the LA Religious Educators Congress. I'm Tom Price, along with our fantastic